Today I am joined by Benjamin Dooley from the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, Michael Levitt, FSWC CEO, and of course our wonderful guest speaker, Michelle Glied-Goldstein. To begin, Benjamin will offer some opening remarks. Benjamin Dooley is the Project and Policy Coordinator for the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, which includes policy, programming, and stakeholder management. Benjamin's interest in human rights stems from the Holocaust education he received as a child and hearing of the experiences of his grandfather as a soldier during the Second World War. He has worked in a variety of international settings as well as in Canada, with a particular interest in human rights and conflict resolution. He began his career as a freelance reporter working overseas during the Arab Spring in Egypt and has worked throughout the Middle East as well as China and Europe. Benjamin, welcome.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for that very kind introduction. And it's a distinct honor for me to be invited to make these brief remarks for this event on behalf of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, which is pleased to partner with the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies on this biweekly In Conversation with the Survivor speaker series. I'd also like to commend the team at the Simon Wiesenthal Center for putting together these events. And these testimonies provide a very important contribution, not only to acknowledging historical truth, but also to the preservation of memory. These are values which are very important to myself personally, because I count myself humbly fortunate to have grown up, as Daniela noted, listening to teachers, guest speakers, and relatives who survived the death camps and munitions factories, and also to my grandfather who fought for Canada during the Second World War. Many of these individuals were children and adolescents, but in some cases also fully grown adults when the terrible events of that period took place, and so could speak in very vivid terms about what they went through. Unfortunately, future generations will not be as lucky as I was, as there are today a dwindling number of those who experienced the Holocaust personally. And so I am delighted by the work of Ms. Glied-Goldstein and what she is doing in continuing her father's legacy and in sharing his story, as well as her work with carrying testimony, so that while those who experienced the Holocaust will sadly one day no longer be with us, their stories and their lessons will not be lost in time. So once again, my sincere thanks to the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for inviting me, and thanks to everybody else who are joining us today. And so I now eagerly await Ms. Glied-Goldstein's remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. We appreciate you joining us, and of course, the partnership with the Raoul Wallenberg Center. At this point, I'll turn the stage over to our guest speaker, Michelle Glied-Goldstein. Michelle, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. And before I begin, I just want to thank the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center and Michael Levitt, Daniela Lurion, Melissa Michael for inviting me and hosting this event, and Benjamin Dooley for your kind remarks, and for the Raoul Wallenberg Center for co-hosting the event. And I really want to thank all of you for joining us today. And you do my father such honor by taking the time to hear his history and to learn the lessons of the Holocaust. And I really appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, how do I put this away so you can't see it? So I'd like to begin the presentation with a short video that will just introduce you to my father.
For a long time, I feel that I have a responsibility as a survivor to make sure that the episode, this terrible event, the Holocaust, should not be forgotten. I feel tremendous elation in the fact that I am sitting in a German court with my daughter, with my granddaughter, which proves that we, like the eternal phoenix, rise again from the Holocaust ashes, that we can survive. I am one of the survivors of Operation Hungary, and I must say that I feel that as long as I live, that experience will never disappear from my mind, my thoughts, and unfortunately my nightmares. And eventually you have to look at yourself in the face and say, well, all right, you have gone through this particular experience, and what are you going to leave for the next generation and for the people who live here? And I feel that I have a responsibility, having survived, that I have a responsibility to talk to people and to tell them what has happened and how these things happened and how they should watch that it, God forbid, should happen in Canada.
I was born in Toronto, and I grew up with a fairly typical household. I grew up with my sisters, Sherry and Tammy, and we had a very happy childhood. I went to school. I loved gymnastics. I took gymnastics classes. But somehow I always felt like our family was different from the other families I knew. It wasn't just that I was a child of immigrants, that we spoke a different language at home, or we ate different kinds of food. There was something more than that. There was a secret or a burden or something that just wasn't talked about in our family. And it wasn't until I was about 16 that my father decided he was ready to start sharing his history with us. And at that time, we went back to Europe, to some of the places that you'll hear about in my presentation today. And my father started to tell his story. After that, he became a survivor speaker in the community. He spoke to thousands and thousands of students in schools. And I had a chance to accompany him on many of those occasions and hear him share his testimony again. And in 2012, my sister organized a family trip back to Europe again. And once again, we had an opportunity to hear my father's history. And then in 2017, I sat down with my father and I interviewed him. And I asked him all the questions that I wanted to try and ask about his Holocaust history. And from all of those opportunities, I became a witness to his history. And it's on that basis that I share it with you today. And I hope that you too, by hearing his history from me, will become a witness to it and will continue to remember it and share it. My father was born in a country that no longer exists called Yugoslavia. He was born on September 6th, 1930, in the small town of Subotica. My dad grew up with his mom and dad in a comfortable and religious, observant family. You can see my grandmother on the left. Her name was Miriam, but everybody called her Puri. She was a homemaker, and my father had wonderful memories of his early childhood with her. My grandfather is on the right. His name was Alexander. Everybody called him Shandor, and he owned the local flour mill. So he was well known in the community because of his business in particular, and they were quite welcome in their mixed community. My dad, as I said, had a very happy childhood. He particularly remembered Friday nights and Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. He said on Friday nights, he would walk hand in hand with my grandfather to synagogue. And when they came home, my grandfather would cup his hands over my dad's head and say a prayer. And my dad, in his memories, really found this very endearing. And he said on Saturday mornings, everything moved a little slower. And my dad would climb into my grandparents' bed and sing songs with my grandmother and tell stories and giggle. And so he had a very happy childhood prior to the Holocaust. My dad had a younger sister. Her name was Aniko. And although you can't tell from this photo, as she got older, she had long, dark hair, and she liked to keep it in braids. And her nickname was Pippi, and I always remember that because of the long braids. My Aunt Aniko was 6 years younger than my father. My father could trace his history in that area of Yugoslavia back to the early 1700s. And they were very, very proud of the country that they lived in. And in fact, if you look at these photos, you can see in the photo on the left, the man on the far left with the very big handlebar mustache, that's my great-grandfather. And in the photo on the right, on the far right, is my grandfather, Shandor. And here we see them wearing the army uniforms of the time. And so they were proud to fight for their country and to be a part of their country. And that made things so very difficult when life started to change. On April 6, 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia in what was called the April War. Things went very quickly and they conquered Yugoslavia. At that time, the Hungarians were allied with the Germans, and the Germans agreed to cede a section of Hungary, including the part where my father lived, a section of Yugoslavia, including the part where my father lived, back to Hungary. And so my father became really part of Hungary again. And slowly, as time passed, the rules and the mandates against the Jews started to take effect. And in March of 1944, the Germans discovered that the Hungarians were no longer allied with them. In fact, the Hungarians had realized that the Germans were going to lose the war and had changed their allegiances. And so Germany took control of Hungary. And then things really started to get worse for my dad. Of course, he had to start wearing the yellow star. And he said things were difficult for a young boy of 13 at the time. They took away all of their radios, and Jews could no longer go to the movies. My dad said he loved the movies. In fact, he said he never in his whole life saw a movie he didn't like. So those things were very difficult for him. But what was even more difficult was what happened at school. One day, the teacher came into the class and she pointed. She said, you, and you, the 4 Jewish students in the class, get up and move to the back of the class. You can't sit with the other kids anymore. My dad always asked students to think about this decision that the teacher had made. But what was even more difficult for my dad was what happened with his friends. So you told me that you were a soccer player at your school and that you played goalie, and you claim that you were a good goalie, but
The best.
The best. Tell me about what happened with the soccer team.
Well, after this incident with the teacher, that we were 4 Jewish kids were put into the back of the class, all of a sudden I'm pushed out of the soccer team. All of a sudden I'm not a good goalie. I'm not there. And what was even more startling to me, I had a very good close friend with whom I was literally lived just down the street from us. So we were constantly playing together and so forth. And he came up to me and he said to me, I can't be your friend anymore. My dad said to me that I cannot be friends with Jewish people anymore. To me, that was sort of an item that I couldn't understand. I speak the same language. I look reasonably the same.
And it's not as though the Jews in the community had done anything to the community.
Not at all. And it's not that it was an immigrant Jewish community or that we weren't there or that people didn't know my grandfather.
My father said, I can't play with Jewish kids anymore. How does a community change to that extent? Time passed, and in May of 1944, the Jews of his community were told that they were to pack up a small bag of belongings. My dad described it as just something you could hold under your arms. And they were to leave the next day, leave their front door unlocked, and report to the city hall. My dad said they thought long and hard about what kinds of things they should pack in their bags. He said people often packed clothing and typical things, but also a lot of photographs, pictures. So they packed their bag and they reported to the city hall. From the city hall, they were told that they were going to be relocated and they were to walk down the center of the street. Of course, it was the center of the street because the Jews could not walk on the sidewalks. and they were to report down to the train station. And this was my dad's experience walking down the street to that train station.
What do you remember about the walk down the street to the train station when you were first deported?
That to me, and I recall that very clearly because we had to walk in the middle of the road, and on the two sides, there were really a lot of people, some kids that I knew from school, and certainly some men that I see from time to time walking into the mill. So certainly we were known, we were a known entity in this town. And they just stood there literally, nobody said anything, and just looked at us and let us walk out of this town as though we don't belong there. And yet, I know, because I now have records, we've been in this area, the Glied family, since certainly I have records going back to 1770. So it's not like we're newcomers there.
When we talk about the Holocaust, we often talk about the bystanders and the collaborators, and this is sort of the first incident where I think about all of those people who just stood by and let my entire family just walk down to their fate. So they walked down the street to this train station, and my dad had been on the train many times before. They had family in neighboring towns, and so he knew, even at 13, what a train would look like and what he should expect. And so when they arrived at the trains, and in fact, what they saw were boxcars, it's easy to imagine how shocked they may have been. The Jews of the town were all loaded up into the boxcars, and this was my dad's experience.
Once you got onto the cattle cars, what was that trip like on your route to Auschwitz?
So you can't imagine really how this cattle car was. We were jam-packed in there like sardines. Really, a lot of the people had to stand. My sister and I were fortunate in the fact that we sat down and started off, but it was jammed, and the noise, babies, there were a number of babies in there crying, and people trying to get each other, move over, and animosity of, don't stand on my foot, and that kind of sense. And then for a while, the train started going, and the two of us sitting there were okay, Mom, being Mom, she brought food with her, so we had something to eat. And then all of a sudden, what came up is a major problem. Somebody had to go to the bathroom. Where is the bathroom? Is there a curtain that you could put up? Or is there a container? Is there a container? And nothing. And imagine us, this group of probably 80, 90 people being in this boxcar for 2 days and 2 nights with this thing happening, You think about it now, I think about, and I can't imagine that people would deliberately subject to people to such inhumanity.
They traveled in those boxcars for 2 days and 2 nights until they arrived into Poland to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the train stopped. The doors were kept sealed, my dad said, for a couple of hours before they actually opened. And when they opened, they descended onto what my dad referred to as the platform or the ramp, which really is this piece of earth between the tracks that you see on the right. And my dad said that this piece of earth is the worst piece of ground in the entire world, and that this piece of earth bears silent witness to the atrocities that happened here.
When you finally arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau and they opened the doors, what did you see? What was it like? What was going on?
Train stopped and waited for a while. And then all of a sudden the doors were swung open. I looked out. There was barbed wire on the other side. This was a graveled sort of a yard in front. And there were some other railroad tracks further away. And then all of a sudden I saw this large group of what I looked at that time as having pajamas on, blue and gray striped pajamas with little round hats, who started swarming in and started to scream at the top of their voices to have everybody out of the boxcars. It was chaos. Really, you can't imagine, First of all, there was no way to get out of the boxcar. Those are fairly high, those cattle cars. So some people jumped out, some people had to be lifted out. People started screaming at each other, and these pajama-clad guys walking in between and saying, "Man, form into a column 5 wide, man and boys, and the women go over there." Just terrible type of thing.
My dad told me that there was such chaos when they got off of these cattle cars. They were tired, they were hungry, they had been really in the dark in these cattle cars, and they came out to the sunshine with the screaming and the people. He said there was such chaos that that moment stayed with him his whole life, and that anytime he came out of a crowded place, a theater or a concert, he could feel sort of that claustrophobic feeling of getting off of that car in that environment. When they got off the cars, they were told to take the packages that they had so carefully packed up and leave them at the side of the tracks. They would come back and get them later. And of course, that was another Nazi lie. And I'll talk a little more about what happened to those packages a little later in the presentation. And then, as my dad said, they were told to line up in 2 columns 5 wide, the men on one side and the women on the other side. And what strikes me in this famous or infamous picture of these columns is not only the columns of all of these people lined up and ready for selection and for the determination of their fate, although they have no idea what's about to happen, but also the SS officers who we see at the front standing so casually and relaxed as they are about to decide the fate of the men and women in those columns, including my family.
I kept on holding on to my dad's hand, and my sister obviously went with my mom. Where they got into line, I don't really know, but I never saw them again. That was the last time coming out of the boxcar that I ever saw them. I never said goodbye. We never kissed or hugged or literally, I don't even think talked to each other at those few moments. Eventually, the columns were formed and started to move step by step very slowly. And I saw this soldier, this officer with a few men. He was standing in the front, and eventually my line came up to him, and he looked at me and he pointed to the side, and he looked at my dad and he pointed. He never said a word to me, never asked me, although before that some of these pajama-clad guys kept walking by and saying to us young kids, say you are 16 years old. But this guy never asked me. He never said anything to me, didn't know where I was or where I come from, or do I speak German, which I did, or anything. He just pointed and went that way. And that. What happened to my mom and my sister at that time? The chaos. Although it seemed to me as the movement was slow, actually, this whole thing went very fast. If you see the contradiction of this situation.
My dad said that it went very fast, and it was literally just with the flick of a finger that the SS officer directed him to the left or to the right. And my father said that really the only reason he survived the Holocaust was because my grandfather, my dad's father, was selected with him to become a slave laborer, and because they stayed together throughout the Holocaust. So my dad and my grandfather were selected to become slave laborers, and the first thing they had to do was go through what was called processing. The first step was that all of their body hair was sheared off of them. They were then taken into a room that had shower heads on the ceiling, and they showered off. My dad said there was no soap or any shampoo or anything like that, but they showered off. And he said it was actually quite embarrassing for him because, again, he was only 13 and he was here naked in a room full of other men, elders from the community, his father, strangers. But he went through this shower, and then they went outside where there was a table, and they were given a uniform, much like the one you see in the screen here, a gray and blue striped jacket, a gray and blue striped pair of pants, a little hat, which you can't see in the photo, and eventually my dad was lucky enough to get a pair of Dutch clogs. And so within just minutes, really, of having arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, my dad and my grandfather would have soon looked like what my dad had described as the pajama-clad men that he saw when he first arrived. My dad and my grandfather were then taken to a barrack like this one. Although when my dad was in the barrack, there were no bunk beds. They slept on the floors. And it turned out that his transport had been selected to actually go to another camp, to go to a subcamp of Dachau, to become slave laborers there. And they were only staying in Auschwitz for what turned out to be 20 days to be in a sort of quarantine and await this transport. So other than daily roll calls, my father really had nothing to do here in Auschwitz. One day he wandered outside of the barrack and he bumped into another young boy.
I approached a kid, he probably must have been a few years older than I am, and it took us a little while till we established that we could speak German together. Right? He must have been Polish, I don't know. And so I asked him, where am I? Because nobody had any idea. Not the people. We had no idea where we were or what's happening in this place. None whatsoever. So I said, well, where am I? So he said, well, you're in Poland. In Poland, and this place is called Auschwitz, this town. And obviously, you're going to become a slave laborer. And so the first thing, of course, that I asked, so where is my mom and my sister? And he said to me, well, how old is your sister? And I said, 8. And he looked at me and he said, well, then they're over there. And I looked there and there was this huge red brick building, chimneys belching smoke. And I said, I didn't understand. What do you mean? And then he explained to me that those people who were not selected to become slave laborers were eventually sent there, and he didn't explain the details, sent there, and they were gassed and burned to death, and burned and the ashes thrown out.
My dad went back to the barrack and found my grandfather and told him the story of what this boy had said. And my grandfather said, do not believe him. It cannot be true. These are educated, civilized people. They would not do such a thing to other human beings. And yet we now know that my grandmother, Miriam, and my aunt, Aniko, were murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. After about 20 days, the transport was in fact moved over to a subcamp of Dachau called Kaufring 3. And what you can see here is the records that we obtained that were provided by Dachau back to Auschwitz, recording the prisoners that they received, sort of like a waybill of transportation of goods. And you can see on here my father, who was assigned a number at Auschwitz, 71572, Bill Glied, on the left, and my grandfather, Sándor Glied, number 71595, on the right. And these kinds of documents are so important to us. The Nazis kept incredible records, and these records help us in our fight against Holocaust deniers. And we also have these records which record the arrivals at Kaufering 3. And you can see here again on the left, my father, number 71572, Bill Glied, and my grandfather, number 71595, Chandra Glied. So what did they find when they arrived at Kaufering 3?
What were the barracks like in Kaufering?
Well, when we got there originally, there was just this huge barbed wire enclosure. Of course, the barbed wire is electrified, double barbed wire, and there were some huts, some prefabricated huts originally, but certainly not enough for all the people. But then we had to build our own quote-unquote barracks, which basically consisted of a ditch in the ground about 6 foot deep, which was lined with wood planks. And then on top of this ditch, we put a triangular roof on it, and all of the earth that we dug out was put on top of the roof. That was to prevent rain from falling in, a door in the front and a window in the back. And about 200 people lived inside this barrack. Really, if everybody wanted to lie on their back, you couldn't do it. So some people lied on the front, but that's where we lived in these underground things, practically 9 months.
So on the left, you can see what the roof of the barracks were like. And we now also know that part of the reason that they were built in this way, dug into the ground with earth-covered roofs, was that this was actually June of 1944, and the Allies were starting to approach and to fly overhead, and they wanted to hide the camp from the view of the jets flying overhead. Now on the right, you can see what the inside of the barrack looked like. And if you think about 200 people having to sleep in a barrack like this, it's pretty easy to understand why diseases ran rampant throughout the camp. So why was my dad brought to Kaufering 3? What were they going to do there? Well, they were going to be building an underground factory or storage facility that was going to keep parts, and specifically engine parts for the German Air Force and the German jets. And those were parts that were made by a company you might recognize called Bayerische Motorenwerke. And for any car lovers out there, that's BMW. So for the engines, the BMW engines that were being manufactured for the German war effort. And the idea was that this facility was actually going to be hidden underground. So it was built in a valley between two hills or mountains, and it was going to eventually be covered over with earth, as you can start to see in the photo on the right, so that it would be completely hidden from aerial view. What was my dad's job working in this facility?
We kids, and there were a few of us, not only me, there were a few, always got through consensus the easier job, the less job. So, for instance, for quite some time, I had this job. There was this huge, literally factory that was churning out the concrete, which was pumped through pipes in order to build this enormous plant. And in this factory, they had this mix. You had to mix the cement with the gravel, and they brought in the cement and dropped it down, and my job was to slit the cement back open and pour it into this funnel. 50 kilograms in, you had about 300-400 bags a day on a shift. By the way, we worked 12 hours a day.
My dad said that it was like a conveyor belt of these cement bags just rolling constantly for the 12-hour day shifts that they worked. And not only did they work 12 hours a day, but they had to wake up, stand for roll call, and be counted before their start of work. Then they had to march out to this facility from the camp, do their 12 hours of work, march back to the camp, be counted again. So this was tremendous physical work. And if you think about it again, and I keep reiterating it, but my dad was 13, maybe 14 at that point. For part of the time that he was working there, he also worked on what he called the tip carts. And these were carts that were filled with gravel that was mined from the side of the mountains and then pushed on these carts down into the valley. And he said, while this wasn't such physically difficult work, it was very dangerous work. If you went too fast, the cart would hit the cart in front of it. And if you went too slowly, you would be hit by the cart behind you. And people died every day managing these carts. Now, with all of this hard physical labor, what kind of food did my dad get to eat?
What you got is a bowl of soup in the evening and a piece of bread. And then you had to decide in the evening, what are you going to do with that piece of bread? Are you going to eat it right there because you were so terribly hungry? So you have to have such willpower, which I didn't have. Or do you keep the piece of bread till next morning so that you have something to eat in the morning? And then you also had to worry about the fact that how are you going to hide this piece of bread because your best friend next to you would steal the piece of bread from you if you could. So usually you put it under your head, you slept on it.
My dad said the kind of hunger that they felt is not anything like we understand. He said it's not what you feel like when you're waiting for dinner and you're hungry after a long day of work. They were absolutely starving. And I told you that he said that the only reason he survived was because he had his dad with him to help him find easier jobs, to help protect him. But he said one thing remained in his memory. One day, my grandfather went to my dad and he said, I'm too full and I can't finish my piece of bread. You eat it. My dad said he was a kid and he was starving. He just took the piece of bread and he ate it. And he said it wasn't until much later that he realized that my grandfather must have been as starving as he was, but that he was trying to protect my father. And my father always remembered that incident. For a couple of days, my dad was taken out of the regular work and taken to a nearby town of Landsberg, Germany, to a pub and you see the doors of the pub in the top left. This is not a very important part of his story, but it's important to me because my dad's job was very simple. He got a clean uniform, which was a big bonus, and all he had to do was stand at the front door of the pub and open the door for the SS officers as they came in. It seems pretty easy. Now, in addition to the clean uniform, one big benefit of this job was that he also was able to steal a newspaper. And he said that was really helpful because he could take it back to the camp to learn a little bit about what was happening in the world and if the Allies were coming, but also because he could use that newspaper to stuff down his uniform to be able to keep him a little bit warmer. But when we went to this pub on our trip, we all stood in front of the doors of the pub to take a photograph. And it struck me as we stood there and looked out at the courtyard that there were all of these apartments around and that there must have been people living in all of these places. And I wonder why none of them who saw my dad, a young kid, clearly starving in a ragged uniform, standing at this front door, and nobody did anything. Nobody brought him a glass of water, an apple, a potato peel. Nothing. Aside from the regular roll calls, every other Sunday, there was something called a fitness test. And it was really very simple. All you had to do was be able to stand up on a chair like this one. This particular photo was taken at a memorial in Krakow. So all you had to do was stand up on a typical chair. And if you could stand up on the chair, you were fit enough to continue working. And if you weren't, you were sent to the Cronken Lager, which is the sick camp. And the sick camp was just a place where people went to die. There was no medication. There was nothing to help you heal or get better. They simply didn't have crematorium or anything like that in Calvary 3. So they sent people to the sick camp to die.
One Sunday afternoon, my dad couldn't step on the chair. And I was next to him, as I always was, that was an important thing. And I think that's why I'm sitting here. And so I knew he's going to be sent away to Cronken Lager, and I'm going to be staying here. And I started crying. And and the camp commander called me out. And asked me in German, why am I crying? I think it was sort of unusual that somebody just stood there and started crying. You cried because you got beaten, or you cried because it was horrible. And I said, well, my father is being sent away to the Cronken Lager. And he said, well, you want to go with him? And I said, yes. And he said, all right. But here again, and these are some of the things I remember, that as I tried to walk towards him, because he was there with a group of people, they stopped me. Because now you had to mark down very officially that prisoner number 71,572, that's me, also went to the Cronken Lager.
So my dad and my grandfather went to the Cronken Lager. They were both very sick with typhoid fever. I asked my dad, what did they do all day in the Cronken Lager? And he said, oh, we sat around and we talked about what we were going to eat when we got home and what dishes we wanted to have prepared for us when we got home. And he said it was just such a remarkable sign of man's willingness to survive, that even though they knew they were going to die in the sick camp, they talked about what they would eat when they got home. But unfortunately, on April 21st, 1945, just 9 days before liberation, my grandfather died in the Cronken Lager. And my father was left an orphan. My grandmother Miriam, my aunt Aniko, murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and my grandfather Shandor murdered by starvation and forced labor. Now, at this time, the Allies, as I said, were approaching, and the Nazis decided that they wanted to clear some of the camps and burn them down to erase any of the evidence of what was going on. And that was what was going to happen to Kaufring 3.
The loudspeakers came up and said, the camp is going to be burned down. And it was burned down. And those who can get out of the camp, there is a train outside. You can get on the train, and the train is going to take you to safety. Didn't say where, going to take you to safety. So those of us who could climb, get out, got onto this train, which was a coal train. That meant that it had no roof on it. It just open, where you put coal in it. Again, packed with people, all kinds of people. And eventually the train started going, and took us maybe an hour until we realized that on the parallel track right next to us was a German armored train. And the German armored train was going the same direction at the same speed as we were. For a while, we didn't know, I didn't, never mind, I didn't understand what's the reason behind it. But then all of a sudden, an American reconnaissance plane started circling around and made a few circles and then flew away. And then 20 minutes later, a squadron of American planes came by and started shooting at this armored train. But we were, distance between the two tracks like this much, no roof, machine guns going, the havoc, the screaming.
My dad had horrible nightmares about this event. I mean, here they were, all of these people who had survived until this point of the war, just days before liberation, and they were bombed by the American army. And so many of the people were murdered, and he just had terrible, terrible nightmares about it. But what was really strange for my father was that in these nightmares, he kept hearing the sound of babies crying. And he couldn't understand why he was hearing the sound of babies crying. And one day, my parents were at a dinner party with other survivors, and my dad was talking about his nightmares about this event and that he couldn't understand why he heard the sound of babies crying. And nobody said anything. But the next morning, my dad got a phone call from a woman named Miriam. She started asking him all kinds of questions. What train was it? Where was it coming from? Where was it going? When was it? And when she could confirm that he was talking about the same train, she said to him, would you like to meet one of the babies who was crying? Well, what happened to my screen here? Well, it turns out that there were 7 Hungarian women who arrived at the camp and they were pregnant. They were hidden. They were brought food. They were brought a Jewish obstetrician who delivered the babies. And there were 7 babies who were on that train and who survived in that camp. And my father often asked, why were these people saved? Was it because the officers who knew about it chose to do something good because that's what they morally felt they needed to do? Or was it because they knew it was the end of the war and maybe this was some way to redeem themselves and be seen in a better light after the war? And my father, the eternal optimist, always said it was just people letting their conscience and their morals come to the rescue and help them do the right thing. The people who survived that train did eventually make it back to the camp. At this point, my dad was very, very sick, but he got back to the camp. And on April 29th, 1945, they woke up and did their regular roll call. And this is the record of that roll call. You can actually see at the very bottom of it, 7 women with their children. And later that day, the American Army liberated the camp. My dad doesn't remember much about liberation. He remembered that somebody with a white helmet and a red cross on it put him on a stretcher and took him away. And it wasn't until sometime in late 2017, early 2018, we actually received these records, which show him at an American Army hospital. You can see his number again, 71572, but they describe him as having something called cachexia, which basically means that he was just withering away. He stayed in the American Army hospital for about 6 weeks, and then he was well enough to make his way back home. Of course, he got to his house. No one in his family had survived. The house had been taken over. He did find some relatives who did survive, and they took him in. They treated him wonderfully, and he lived with them for a couple of years. And then in 1947, my dad was very proud to be amongst the first 1,000 Jewish orphans welcomed into our great country, Canada. Canada's history and record before this wasn't so wonderful. And in fact, the government, Mackenzie King had said none is too many, but at this point, their policies had changed. And my father was so proud to become a Canadian and was a proud Canadian his whole life. As I mentioned, in 2012, we went as a whole family back to Europe and back to Auschwitz. And this is a photograph of all of us standing under the gates of Auschwitz I, my dad, my mom, my sisters, our spouses, our children, my dad's grandchildren, relatives, friends that we call relatives. And my dad said that this photo should have a caption that says, "Hitler, you lost." Now, I told you that one of the things that we often think about is the bystanders or the people who were collaborators or just stood by and did nothing. And I often think about what those people felt after the war, what happened with them when things went back to normal.
Several years ago, I guess 30 or so years ago, you received an anonymous package. Tell me about that.
Most interesting thing, actually the package came via this aunt who took me in, who eventually moved from Yugoslavia to Israel. This package was sent to her, and then she sent it on to me and told me that the package came to her with a letter saying that the contents got into this woman's possession. That's what the words that she used, that the contents got into
her possession.
Got into her possession, and it bothers her being in her house, and she hopes that somebody from the Glied family survived. She knows that my aunt survived, and she married, and she's sending it on to her in the hope that my aunt sent it to me, which contained some of the Judaica that my parents used, some silver stuff, my mom's prayer book, their marriage ketubah, their marriage certificate, some photographs and things which I have here, came to me in 1966, the year that you were born.
And you have no idea who.
No idea who the woman is, no.
So it came into her possession, and we can only imagine that it came into her possession when my family left their home with, as they were instructed to do, the doors left unlocked. And most of the pictures that you see in this presentation of my family are pictures that we received in that package. But the item that's most meaningful to me from that package is my grandmother's Siddur, my grandmother's prayer book, because this is the inside front cover of that prayer book. And you can see that it's been inscribed by my grandfather on the date of his marriage to my grandmother in 1928, and then on the date of my dad's birth, September 6th, 1930, and then on the date of my Aunt Aniko's birth. And the fact that it's in his physical handwriting makes it the closest thing that I have to the grandfather I never had the opportunity to know.
Basically, because I'm a terrible optimist, I feel that human beings are essentially good, but they're so easily persuaded to do bad. And unless the few people who are there who say this is bad and stand up for it and do something about it, then the same thing that has happened, people say, well, this will never happen. But it will never happen only if people are there who are going to fight this. And current events seem to prove us.
You may recall that when they arrived to Auschwitz-Birkenau, they were told to take their packages that they had packed up to come and leave them at the side of the rail tracks. Well, of course, they never went back to get those packages. Instead, those packages were sent to a special area of Auschwitz called Canada, because Canada was considered the land of wealth. And in that area, this Oscar Groening, who you see in the photograph here, was responsible for accounting for all of the things that were in those packages, going through them, sorting through them, determining what was of value and could be sent back to Germany for use in the war effort, and what was of no use. And so he became known as the accountant of Auschwitz. But Oscar Groening is known for one other very important thing. Oscar Groening was, thanks to the incredible work of the Honorable Thomas Walter, brought to trial in 2015 on 300,000 counts of accessory to murder in the case of the Hungarian Jews. The reason he was brought was that there were days when he actually worked on the ramp, and we can correlate those days to one of the days was the day that my father actually arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So when I showed you the photograph of the columns of people lined up for selection, and those SS officers who were standing in the front, whose responsibility it was to organize them and make sure everything went smoothly, Oscar Groening would have been one of them. And Thomas Walter was able to bring him to trial on a charge of accessory to murder, which had never been done in Germany before. And what he was able to show was that it doesn't matter if you're the one who actually does the murdering. If you are complicit, if you are an accessory to a murder, you are guilty of a crime. And this is such an important precedent for us. This trial of Oscar Groening, my father had an opportunity to testify at the trial, and it was such an important time for him. It gave him the opportunity not only to share his history and have it recorded on the German court records for forever into the future, which was important to him, but also to be able to do something for his parents and for his sister, who never had the voice to be able to do it as well. When my father finished his presentations, as he did so many, when he finished his presentations, he always ended with the same 3 messages, and I'd like to share them with you today. The first thing he said is, when we're finished today, stand up and kiss the ground that we stand on, because we are so lucky to live in the great country of Canada. But really, it's up to all of us to make sure that this continues to be the great country that my dad was so proud of. Next, he said, hug and kiss the people you love. And unfortunately, during COVID, those are often virtual hugs, but hug and kiss the people that you love because it is so hard to live without them. And finally, he said, do one good thing today. Whatever it is, big or small, just do one good thing today. Because if all of us could do one good thing, we could all make the world a much better place. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to share my father's history with you today.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing that. I know, speaking on behalf of myself and others on the call that had the pleasure and the honor of listening to him speak live, this just captured it all and brought back so many memories. And you honored his memory so well. And I know that every single time that you do this presentation, others get to hear the story as well. So at this point, I just want to turn the stage over to our president and CEO, Michael Levitt, to do a couple of closing remarks as well. Thank you so much, Michelle. And
thank you.
Thank you very much. And Michelle, I've had the opportunity to view this with you once before, and it's like your dad is there. And I had the honor of working with him at Chat and doing a presentation there. And I can tell you that the look on the kids' faces with every word that he uttered, delivering his testimony directly to him. This was, just a few years ago. They were riveted. And I think the importance of the work that you're doing to make sure that his voice and the voice of so many other survivors is permanently saved. I think we're all just feeling like he's in the room with us today. That just comes across. The warmth comes across, and the call to action that he gave, the call to action about not being silent, and as he said, looking at what's going on in the world, around us. I think it's more true even in the last couple of years than it was when he recorded this with you, and that's why events like today and the work that everybody who's in this field, the work that's being done is so important. And I know that nobody understands that more than you. And I also want to recognize, you mentioned Judge Thomas Walter, and Judge Walter is actually on with us here this afternoon. So virtually he is somewhere amongst the tiles here. We're actually working with Judge Walter on another case that he's working on charges that have been laid, and we've put a special appeal out. So I just want to thank the judge for being here with us today for this event. Really, I know so many of you that join us for the In Conversation series come back every 2 weeks like clockwork, and we're so appreciative of that, because we know that it's hearing and talking about these voices, the voices like Bill's and their experiences, and making sure that the next generation and the next generation and the next generation never forget these stories is just absolutely critical. So thank you all for joining us for this presentation again, and to Benjamin Dooley, to our friends at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre. Thank you so much to Erwin Kotler and to all the staff there, and to Benjamin for delivering our some opening remarks for us. I'm going to turn the floor back over. I know Daniela's got a couple of last things she wants to relay, but once again, please keep coming back and joining us for each and every one of these voices. I know we have a Rwandan survivor, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide coming up in a number of weeks, and we're going to continue, reaching out and making sure that we are, following through on this. Never forget, never ever forget. And again, thank you for being here this afternoon. Thanks, Daniela.
Thanks, Michael. And again, on behalf of FSWC, as Michael echoed, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, especially to Michelle. Thank you for sharing your story and your father's testimony. I can't imagine that it's easy for you to do that, so we certainly appreciate it. I know those in the call who did not have the opportunity to hear your father tell his story certainly appreciated the opportunity today to see the videos and to hear the story. And it's such an important piece, and it really is the future of Holocaust education, is that this is what this will look like, this whole idea of the carrying testimony. So we certainly really appreciate you for taking your time to do that this afternoon. I want to thank everyone on the call for joining us once again. We hope you'll join us 2 weeks from today on March 10th, when Pinchas Guter will be sharing his testimony as well. Thank you all, everybody. Have a great night.